work with a leader to unlock his or her potential, I try and do it in three different steps: assessment, development planning, and development. Let me talk about each of these briefly. When I say assessment, I like to understand the leader from three different perspectives. One is I like to spend about 4 to 5 hours with the leader, really understanding their journey, their childhood, the formative years, some of the key choices they made, and how they've grown through the various stints, and also a little bit of the why behind the various choices they made, because that gives me a sense of what they're solving for and what's important for them. Second, I like to talk to a few people around the leader to form a little more of a holistic view. And there are 3 or 4 types of people I like to talk to. One is people in the current organization. 2 is people in the organization you might have worked with, ex-bosses, ex-peers, and so on. I also like to talk to people in the ecosystem. For example, if I'm working with the MD of an investment bank, I find it helpful to talk to some of the other people in the market the person might have interfaced with. It could be clients, it could be customers, it could be VC investors, it could be board members. And that gives me a little more of a richer picture of how the leader shows up in different contexts. I also like to talk to a couple of people in the non-work front. It could be a sibling or a spouse or a parent. And I find that unlocking the potential of a person is often about understanding what gives person energy and what frustrates the person. It's not just about understanding the skills and development areas. And sometimes that data can be better accessed outside the work context. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar is a couple of psychometrics which I use. It could be Hogan or Belbin or FIRO-B or MBTI. I try and pick the psychometric that's fit for purpose, which gives me a little bit of a triangulated view of the leader, but also gives me hypotheses to probe when I have these conversations. After this, I sort of do a comprehensive analysis of the data from various sources and write a longish 10 to 15 page report and share the feedback with the leader. That's sort of assessment. And then we move to development planning, and that varies from case to case. If it's an organization, then I need to understand how development planning works in a certain organization. But if the leader is solving where to go, then maybe it's a discussion around career choices. So development planning is often a series of 3 or 4 conversations. We say, depending on what showed up in the assessment, what do we want to work on? And what's a really effective way to work on some of these things? And then we move to the long tail development. And I believe in having a little bit of an arm's length relationship between assessment and development planning and the long tail development. And in a way, this view is informed by what I observed in sports. If I talk about my podcast, one of the guests at the Play to Potential podcast was Viren Raskina, ex-hockey player for India, who's now the CEO of Olympic Gold Quest. When I asked him the question about how they pick coaches for their athletes, he said when boxing was first introduced to the Olympics for women in 2012, it was announced in 2009, it was introduced in the 51 kilo category. And at that stage, Mary Kom was already a world champion in the 46 kilo category. So the key development need for her was for her to train and put on weight and really fight heavier opponents. So as they went about looking for a coach for Mary Kom, they said, let's work with a coach who's helped players go up weight category. And they picked a gentleman called Charles Atkinson, who worked with Mary Kom. And the rest of Mary Kom's journey is stuff of legend. The crux of the point I want to make is that the person you want to work with in the long tail development should be best suited to address that development need. To give you an example from my journey, I was recently working with an entrepreneur who runs a large renewables business. And when I did his leadership assessment, he was great in multiple things, but the one thing where he needed to develop was about being productive and about managing his time effectively. And he said, can you help me get better at this? And I said, I could do it, but I'd rather put you in touch with the best guy in this category who works with leaders to help them become more productive with their time and with their calendars and emails and so on. And I put him in touch with a Frenchman in Australia, a gentleman by the name Cyril Pupillon, who worked with him for a long period of time and unlocked significant value. So that's what I mean by arm's length. The person who's doing the diagnosis need not be best equipped to deal with the long tail development. And that's not to say that I want to walk away from the relationship. Of course, I want to add value, but at the same time, I don't want to sort of take it for granted that I'm best placed to add value in the long tail of development. So I try and ensure 3 things in my approach. One is I over-index on the assessment. I find that gives me the conviction to go down a certain path. Second, I find it easier to talk about this as a show the mirror exercise and then followed by a long tail development rather than a coaching exercise. And the reason I say is a lot of the leaders I encounter develop a little bit of an allergic reaction when you say you need a coach. I'd rather say I'll spend some time with you, I'll speak to a few people around you, I'll show you the mirror, hopefully build trust with you, and hopefully you find the insights of value. Then if I can be of value in your long tail development, let's have a chat at that time, rather than saying, I'm your coach, let's get started. And the third, the long tail development I feel is a bespoke conversation, and I don't believe in coming with pre-packaged 6-month journeys or 2-month journeys or 9-month journeys. I feel each leader's context is unique, and I'd like to get to that point to really figure out what makes sense in that context. The other piece I want to talk about is the kind of situations where I feel I add value and I don't add value. If I reflect on the kind of coaching conversations I've had over the last few years, I think there are a couple of situations where I feel I'm not differentiated and I don't add distinctive value. One is leaders that are not convinced about coaching or don't have the mind space to engage with coaching in a proactive way. And I think in those situations, you need a coach who's a little more tough, who can hold the coachee accountable and really drive through to results. I realize that both from a skill and a will perspective, I'm not that person. Second, I realize that there are several situations where people come to you with a very clear diagnosis on what they're solving for. Right? I want to work on X or Y or Z. And I realize that could I do that? Yes. But am I really differentiated and distinctive in working with those people? Probably not. So to give you a healthcare metaphor, on the spectrum of orthopedics to physiotherapy, I feel I'm more differentiated and I can add more value on the orthopedics end of the spectrum. I realize that there are different ways to think about leadership development, and different coaches structure it differently. This just happens to be my approach, given my worldview and my journey and my capabilities. Thank you for listening.